Hello again, this is Dr. Lindsay. And in this video, I'm going to be going through some examples of using the stabilization policy. So we'll start with the first example. We'll say the economy is inside the PPF and real output is less than potential. Maybe in a recession, maybe just not a recession, but not doing all that great, not doing like the economy should be doing. And let's say the unemployment rate is 8%. It's got to be something greater than 6, because 4 to 6 is full employment. So if we're going to be in a recession inside the PPF, there's got to be some idleness, idle machines, idle people, which means unemployment. Now let's say inflation is 1%, which is low. It's not really a problem, except that it's probably not ideal as to what economists would like to see. So let's draw that using this Keynesian macro model. We'll put inflation on the vertical axis, real output on the horizontal axis. We've got an aggregate supply curve that is upward sloping, aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. This intersection here is going to be at 1%. And the equilibrium is going to be less than potential. So potential might be something like right here, to the right of it. So if we're in this kind of situation, what could be done? Well, Congress and the president could try to do some fiscal policy, increasing government spending or lowering taxes to increase aggregate demand if they want to. Or the Federal Reserve could try to do something, which would be to increase the money supply. So let's say the Fed, through the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, decides to increase the money supply. That has an effect on lowering interest rates. And that has the effect of increasing aggregate demand, probably consumption and investment spending. And the result will be aggregate demand will shift to the right because of this increase in the money supply. And we'll have a new equilibrium, short-run equilibrium, which we'll probably get to fairly quickly, that will now be closer to full employment, potential output. That recessionary gap will be shorter, and it might increase the inflation rate. Depends on the shape of that short-run aggregate supply curve. If it's fairly flat, then we won't see an increase in the inflation rate right away. The inflation takes a little more time to show up than a change to GDP in the economy. Okay, let's take another example. Let's say that the economy is at potential. So output is equal to potential output, meaning we are on the PPF. And let's say employment is 5%. Sounds about right, because we're going to be on the PPF and unemployment has to be somewhere around 4 to 6 in that neighborhood. So the economy is doing very well, but let's say inflation is 6%. Now that's kind of high. Most economists don't want to see it that high. Most people don't want to see it that high. They'll start complaining to their politicians about prices going up. And they feel like, hey, I can't buy as much now. Prices are going up. And maybe wages aren't going up right away. Usually if there's inflation, price going up, wages go up too. But some people may not see their wages go up and may not be happy about it or think their wages aren't going up and start complaining about prices going up. So let's draw this situation using the Keynesian macroeconomic model, short-run model. Got this aggregate supply curve upward sloping, aggregate demand curve downward sloping, and we are at potential with an inflation rate of 6%. And of course, we want to draw our long run aggregate supply curve, which would be vertical there at potential. So let's draw that long run aggregate supply curve at potential. Like this. So the Fed has this dual mandate: maximum sustainable employment and stable prices. And right now, 6% inflation would not be considered stable prices. So the Federal Reserve would be expected to do something about it. And what are they going to be doing? They're going to be moving towards a contractionary stance, or at least away from an accommodative stance. If that was causing the problem by having too loose of a monetary policy, then they should move to a neutral stance, and 6% contractionary too. So that would mean essentially reducing the money supply is what they're going to have to be doing. And as they lower the money supply, interest rates are going to be going up. Interest rates are going to go up. More expensive to buy a house. Slows down the demand for homes. Builders don't need to hire as many people for building homes. Not going to be buying as many cars because most everyone borrows the money to buy a new car. So when that happens here, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. We'll have a new equilibrium. And the inflation rate will be lower, but maybe not that much lower right away. And output will be lower. So the Fed will be creating this output gap. And if they're not careful, they could easily push the economy into a recession. And they've done that before. There was a recession in the 1980s. It was entirely because of the Fed decreasing the money supply too much, increasing interest rates, lowering aggregate demand, and the new equilibrium was a recession in this country. It's going to take some time for the inflation rate to fall. So the Fed has to be careful not to do too much too fast. What they would probably try to do in this case is lower aggregate demand a little bit, enough that prices will start to fall a little bit, but it won't push us into a recession. They'll do it slowly over time, and it will take time. It's not something they can do very quickly because it takes a while for inflation to fall. But in the long run, the inflation rate will come down. They just have to be careful when they're doing it. Let's take a look at monetary policy during the recession, the 2020 pandemic. Here's inflation. Here's the long run aggregate supply curve, short run aggregate supply curve. I'll draw this with a little bit of a slope to it. Oops. Short one. Aggregate supply curve. And we were at potential because the unemployment rate was only 4%. All right, I'm not the greatest artist. So we were right here. Full employment, 2%. Then there was this big drop in aggregate demand. Once again, aggregate demand shifted back very suddenly to the left, creating an output gap, big drop in GDP, and inflation was actually starting to fall too. And then our government hit the pause button on the economy, which shifted this aggregate supply curve to the left, kept the inflation from falling too much, but lowered output in the economy. So remember fiscal policy, there were stimulus checks, increase in G, lowering T, to try to push aggregate demand to the right. I'll draw that in green. So there's some fiscal policy. And then there was a lot of monetary policy too. The Fed increased the money supply, lowered interest rates, brought interest rates down to about 0, and then continued to increase the money supply substantially by trillions of dollars, more really than they ever had done before, which pushed aggregate demand to the right. So this will be monetary policy. And kept stimulating it. Probably too much for too long with their accommodative policy, and probably should have moved to a neutral stance faster than they should have. This is a graph of the interest rates that the Federal Reserve has good control over. And when they increase the money supply, this interest rate drops very quickly. And this is a graph of this interest rate. It's called the federal funds rate. Goes back to about 1955. And those shaded areas are recessions. And what you'll see is you look through here is that every time there's a recession, that interest rate drops. And then in between the recessions, it starts to go back up. And this is entirely because of the Federal Reserve stabilization policy. When they realize there's a recession or a recession's about to start, they increase the money supply, which lowers interest rates. And you can see it on the graph right there, this lowering of interest rates during these shaded areas. If they're good, they can actually do it ahead of time. That's their accommodative stance. Then, after the recession's over, they can move back to a neutral stance or a contractionary stance to prevent the inflation from getting out of control. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, 2010, they actually lowered this interest rate all the way down to 0, which had never happened before. They actually wanted to lower it more than that, but it was very hard to get that interest rate down below 0, the nominal interest rate.